instant minute-by-minute basis, if possible.
And what was going on in Sarajevo was somewhat posturing for the international media. Whether we like it or not, the presence of CNN, ITV, BBC, and the Sky News Network and many others was an intimidating factor for any military operation going on in Sarajevo that would be seen by the world, and the world would pass judgment based on what was going on in Sarajevo. As a soldier, it probably made a lot of sense to tie up the media in Sarajevo, and then whatever your objectives were in the rest of Bosnia could be done without the presence of the media.
The first serious atrocities in Bosnia took place outside the capital before fighting in Sarajevo began. The first massacre of the war, which was carried out on March 26th in Sjekovac near Bosanski Brod in northern Bosnia, was ignored by Western news organizations. Interestingly, the slaughter of 5 Serbian families and the burning of the village by Croatian forces was reported by the pro-government Sarajevo newspaper Oslobođenje. A week later, on April 2nd, Croatian forces captured the town of Kupres in central Bosnia. After the town was recaptured, Serbian television offered footage of Serbian soldiers and civilians who had been mutilated to Eurovision in Geneva for worldwide transmission. But they were turned down by officials in Geneva who said they already had the story from the Croatians.
The Serbs have been fragmented in their response to the media. They were hampered in the first instance by the fact that the television uplinks were in Sarajevo and Zagreb, and they were not able to get their message out in the first stages of the breakup of Yugoslavia. But since then, they were slow to learn how to use the Western media.
In a murky, complicated, violent situation, it's a lot easier for a lazy reporter or a lazy editor to get it from the press agents. And the Bosnians had a better press operation, pure and simple.
Reports of Serbian atrocities in cities such as Prijedor in northern Bosnia and Zvornik on the Drina River were broadcast repeatedly in Western countries. Meanwhile, the Serbian population of Mostar, the capital of Herzegovina, was virtually eliminated in violent attacks by combined Muslim and Croatian forces in June of 1992. But with the exception of the British Guardian, this event went unnoticed in the West.
Mostar presented an enormous problem because it was even more dangerous than Sarajevo. In fact, there are many in the United Nations and those observers within Bosnia who say that the situation in Mostar was far worse than Sarajevo, if that's possible. It almost seems hard to imagine.
Some of the worst atrocities were undertaken by Muslim paramilitary units in eastern Bosnia against Serbian villages such as Kamenica and Milici. Bloody Serbian reprisals in Srebrenica made international headlines in 1995, but for the first 3 years of the war, Srebrenica was the stronghold of Muslim warlord Nasser Oric, who drove out the Serbian population and carried out scores of massacres against surrounding villages, including the killing of 500 Serbian civilians on Orthodox Christmas Eve in 1993.
Serb public relations was so poor that they weren't doing what they needed to do to get Serbs on television. They needed to hire a Washington PR firm, the way the Muslims did, or a New York PR firm, and get their people on the air. They didn't do it. So partly it's a mechanical failure on the part of the Serbs, but of course partly it's a refusal by the networks and by the big newspapers to acknowledge that there was another point of view.
Reporters in Bosnia have largely been based in Sarajevo. There's very few that have gone into the Serb areas and spent any time in Serb areas, and that's considerably biased their reporting as well.
When news did emerge from the fighting in the Bosnian countryside, it was sometimes dangerously misleading. Brutal conditions in 2 Serbian-run prison camps, Omarska and Karaterm, were brought to public attention in early August of 1992 by Newsday reporter Roy Gutman. Gutman would later win a Pulitzer Prize for his work. But his use of the term death camps was unjustified in the view of Holocaust historian Simon Wiesenthal and a number of other journalists.
When the first stories came out about concentration camps, we really knew no more than the press had indicated. But then the State Department didn't make an effort to go and independently verify what had happened. So we were really left with this impression of mass killing, which turns out in retrospect to have been quite incorrect.
Roy Gutman's journalistic standards and use of second-hand witnesses was questioned in a well-documented investigative article by journalist Thomas Deichmann in the German publication Die Woche. Much of Gutman's information came from Jadranka Cigelj, a Croatian woman from Prijedor. Cigelj was an official of a German-based front group for a variety of neo-fascist organizations, including the German Nationalist Party and the present political arm of the old World War II Ustashi. Jadranka Cigelj's accounts of rape and mayhem by Bosnian Serb forces attracted much media attention in the West, including from ABC anchorman Peter Jennings.
Omarska. There, many of the prisoners were tortured. The women were raped. One of the women was Jadranka Cigelj.
But crucial details kept changing in her accounts of events at Omarska and Prijedor.
If you look at Roy Gutman's article about her, she blames the camp commander in Omarska, a guy called Zirko Mejahic, as having raped her. And she blames tells another few names as well. But in other eyewitness reports, she accuses different Serbs having raped her in Omarska, which again raises questions about her credibility. It became clear that she tells different stories to different people, and that raised for me quite important questions about the role of the media and the question about the sources you're going to use.
The War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, which investigated these charges, came to a similar conclusion when they declined to use Cigelj to testify on events she claimed to have witnessed. Charges against the commander of Omarska were quietly dropped by the War Crimes Tribunal several years later. Several weeks after Roy Gutman's sensational articles were published, a major interagency intelligence report by the U.S. concluded that while serious abuses had taken place, there was no evidence of organized mass killing.
We can be fairly certain that there hasn't been mass killing in the concentration camps. There's just no evidence of that whatsoever.
The International Committee of the Red Cross, known as the ICRC, stated officially, quote, "Serbs, Croats, and Muslims all run detention camps and must share equal blame."
The Muslims were running camps, and the Croats were running camps, and the ICRC in that same week had a delegation going around looking at camps run by all sides, and there were abuses taking place on all sides.
Ironically, the first mention of the phrase concentration camp occurred in the New York Times 2 months earlier, referring to a Muslim-run facility near Konjic. Times reporter John Burns noted that the UN confirmed that Serbian civilians who survived a Muslim massacre were being incarcerated in a railroad tunnel. Under international pressure, the 2 worst prison camps, Omarska and Karaterm, run by the Serbs, were shut down in 1992 after 4 months of operation. But neither Burns nor any other Western reporters bothered to report on the brutal Muslim camp near Konjic or the Croatian camp Dretelj, where killings and atrocities were routine.
There were Serbs in camps held even after the end of the war. And there were Serbs being held in Sarajevo in horrible conditions in a drain pipe. And journalists knew about it and never wrote about it.
There is no use anybody pretending that there are innocents in this business and that there is one side that is pure white, the victims, and the other side, pure wrong, black, the aggressors. That is not the case.